Welcome to your AP Macroeconomics exam review. As I promised before, I was going to try to compile all the main graphs that you're going to need to know for your AP Macro exam, and I started with 5, and then I was like, oh, I need another one, and the 6 and 7. So I have written here that there are 7 graphs that dominate the study of macroeconomics. The reality is there's probably more than 7. No, there are definitely more than 7 graphs in macroeconomics. And some of them, not all 7 of these, are equally important. So anyway, we're going to start with the most important of them, the granddaddy of them all, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And we'll talk about all the other ones. I went through like the past decade worth of AP tests and found that almost every single one of them in their free response required you to be able to draw this model. So knowing this one is probably the most important. There's a good chance you'll have to draw this on your AP test. So let's start with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply. And like all of our graphs in econ, we really have price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis, but because this is the macroeconomics, we're not really talking about the price of a good. What we're really talking about is the price level of all goods and services in the country. So we'll label it price level. And when we're talking about quantity, again, it's not the quantity of a good, it's the quantity of all goods and services, and that is really real GDP. Make sure you label your things correctly. Second, then, that we need to draw on here, of course, is our demand curve, which we're going to model. It's sloping downward. At high price levels, people don't buy a lot of stuff. At low price levels, people want to buy a lot of stuff. And so we have our aggregate demand, because it's the demand of all goods and services, so it's that aggregate demand. And supply, like we saw in micro and other places, supply shifts upward. Supply curve is upward, sloping, because as price levels go up, I'll write this here, you'll see in a second, as price levels go up, you're willing to work more, you're willing to supply more, you're willing to produce more. At a low price level, you're not willing to produce as much, and so we get that upward sloping supply curve. And really what this is the short run aggregate supply. And it's important that we distinguish between the short run and the long run, because in the long run, how much we can produce is really independent of the level of prices. And so what we're going to end up having to draw here is a long run aggregate supply curve. But before I do that, let me point out what I just drew in here, which is, of course, is that equilibrium price level and equilibrium quantity. I did label it Y because we know GDP is both the sum of all income, but also the sum of all expenditure, and we often use Y as that national income level. So I'm just going to label it as Y, and that's our equilibrium. That's our short run equilibrium. If we are in long-run equilibrium, that would mean we are working at full employment. What that means is basically anybody who wants a job has a job. Sorry about that line. I had a hair I had to wipe off my screen. So, in long-run equilibrium, we have full employment. Now, that doesn't mean we have zero unemployment. It means we have the natural rate of unemployment, about 5% unemployment. And that's because there are always people who just graduated or are between jobs. Those structurally or frictionally unemployed people are part of our natural unemployment rate. But at full employment, it means we don't have anybody laid off because the economy is struggling. And so what that looks like, because long-run aggregate supply is just an amount, it's the total amount of stuff we could produce. It's a horizontal line, And because we are in long run equilibrium, that would imply then that the short run equilibrium is at the long run aggregate supply curve. Now, we won't necessarily stay there. A lot of things can change. So these next two graphs just show the inflationary gap and the recessionary gap. Just like the equilibrium graph, we're going to have our, let's see, price level. We're going to have our GDP. We're going to have our aggregate demand. We're going to have our aggregate supply. I should really label that. Let me back that up and label that as short run aggregate supply. And we're going to have our equilibrium, and we're going to have our equilibrium price level and our equilibrium quantity. If we were in this long run equilibrium and the Fed was using expansionary monetary policy and it was increasing aggregate demand, that demand curve would kind of shift out this way, and it would actually drive the price level, the new equilibrium price level would increase. And at this point, we're actually beyond full employment. And when we're at that point there, that's what we call a recessionary gap. So an inflationary gap. So if I'm going to draw the inflationary gap, I'm going to draw my short run equilibrium at a point beyond my long run aggregate supply. Now, what happens if we're in an inflationary gap? Well, we're above full employment, aren't we? This is Y of full employment, so we're above full employment. If that's the case, our classic example in class was what happened at that Walmart in North Dakota, and what you saw was that cashiers were getting paid like $17.20 an hour. And their unemployment rate at that time was at like 0.8%, way above full employment. So what was happening is wages were being driven up, and if wages are being driven up, if it left alone, supply is going to decrease, and we'll get back to that long-run equilibrium. So if we did nothing, short-run aggregate supply would shift back because wages went up, and you'd end up back at your equilibrium. I'm not going to leave that on my drawing. I'll delete that off. So what about a recessionary gap? What if the economy falls into a recession? Well, if I'm drawing that, it's going to look very similar to all the other graphs I've just done. Aggregate demand, GDP. Do make sure you label everything. Price level, equilibrium, price level, there we go. Equilibrium quantity. If we are in recession, that would mean we're actually below full employment. So if this is the long-run aggregate supply, how much stuff we could produce if everybody was working, we are currently producing at a level that's below the full employment level. So if we're there, what's going to happen? Well, if we do nothing and unemployment levels are low, people are desperate for jobs, people will eventually take lower wages to just get a job. Lower wages, lower input costs are going to drive an increase in aggregate supply, and so we would shift back to that equilibrium. Now here's maybe the big area where classical and Keynesian economists disagree. The classical economist would say, yeah, leave it alone. We will get back to that equilibrium. Wages will decrease, and then output will increase, and we'll get back to our potential GDP. Keynes was like, that's all well and good, that might happen in the long run, but I might be dead before that happens, and in the meantime, life sucks. So, we need to do something, and we need to actually fix that. So Keynes, his idea was, well, let's increase, part of our aggregate demand is government expenditure, so we could increase our government expenditure. So this is Keynes here. We could increase aggregate demand by the government spending, by an increase in government expenditure. That's an increase there in government expenditure. And the nice thing about that, he was like, look, if government starts spending, that turns into income for people. And if people earn income, they turn around and buy stuff. And so you get additional consumption as well. And so we get that multiplier effect where we get an increase not just because of the government expenditure, but also because consumption is going to go up, and that will get us back to that equilibrium. We'll come back to this a little bit later as we're looking at one of the sample problems to hopefully more thoroughly understand all of that. But I'm going to leave my graph. I went too far back there. As long run aggregate supply. So here's the recessionary gap, there's the inflationary gap, and that's the long run equilibrium. As I just mentioned, Keynes said we had this multiplier effect, and really that multiplier effect hinges a lot on this consumption function. In the consumption function, we're looking at income. So this is national disposable income, and our levels of consumption. Consumption, expenditure. Let me rewrite that. Let me just call that our expenditure plans. Expenditure plans. Now, in this graph, there is always this little 45-degree line. That 45-degree line, that y equals x line, right? Maybe I'll even label that y equals x line, because that's how you think about it in math class. That would be at any point along this line. That would be where what we plan to spend equals the amount of money that we make. If we were at some point on this side of it, that would mean our expenditure plan is lower than our income. So if our expenditure is lower than our income, that means we are saving money. And if we're on this side of the line, that means our up here, for instance, our expenditure is a lot higher than our income, and so at that point we are borrowing. Now, as we saw in our game that we did in class, you as human beings and really with our government and businesses as well, there is some level of spending that you will do even if you make no money. Gotta buy food, gotta buy housing, you'll do some level of spending. It's more really a theoretical point than a real point, but there is going to be some point that is going to be spending. That is our level of autonomous spending. So from here to here, that is autonomous, meaning spending. Meaning that's going to happen regardless, and often we consider government spending and investment spending are parts of autonomous spending, and actually part of your consumption is going to be autonomous as well. Now, if you start making some money, if you have some income, you're going to spend it, but you're probably not going to spend all of it. If you made $100, you're probably going to spend a percentage of it. Maybe you'll spend 50 cents of it, or maybe you'll spend maybe you'll spend 85 cents of it. The other you will save. And so what we end, and that difference, the amount that you're willing to spend, is what we call the marginal propensity to consume. I should spell that right. That's what happens when you go too fast. Marginal propensity to consume, the MPC. This is going to be very important for a function that we use for the multiplier effect, which multiplier equals 1 over 1 minus the MPC. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. So the consumption function then has a slope of the MPC. You earn an extra dollar, you don't spend a full extra dollar, you spend a small portion of it, right? So if your income goes up from there, you don't spend necessarily that much of it, you spend part of it. And so we get this line that looks like that, and we call that the consumption function. And the slope of that is the MPC. Now, the reason that's important is because if there's some change in autonomous spending, right, we would have some equilibrium income, which is equilibrium, again, income and GDP are basically synonymous here. So we have some equilibrium national income. If there was some increase in government spending, for instance, then, let me draw that in a different color here, then we might get this shift in the consumption function, and we get a new equilibrium. My drawing is maybe not perfect, but the point is we had a small increase in autonomous spending, and we had a bigger increase in the total consumption, the total national income. And that is that multiplier effect. In words, that multiplier effect is, while the government spent some, it turned into income that people turned around and spent, and so we got, and that money that was spent turned into income to somebody else that they spent a portion of, and so on and so forth. So if, say, with this multiplier effect, let's just say if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8 and government spending increases by we'll just use $1 million. Ooh, ha, ha. Government increases spending by 1 million. The total effect on the increase in consumption, the increase in demand, is going to be the 1 million, because the government increased their spending, times 1 over 1 minus 0.8. That's the MPC. 1 minus 0.8 is 0.2. 1 divided by 0.2 is 5. So you'd see it's 5 million. And I'm out of space. There we go. $5 million. So that was kind of key to Keynes' idea there. All right, how about the Phillips curve? Let's do the Phillips curve, and then I will break up this video into a different section, because otherwise it's going to be an agonizingly long video. The Phillips curve just shows the relationship between inflation and unemployment. Unemployment and inflation. And what we see, is that in the short run, you're going to have at higher unemployment rates, you're going to have lower inflation, and at low unemployment rates, when everybody's working, North Dakota, you're going to have much higher inflation rates. That's true in the short run. In the long run, we have a natural unemployment rate. I've talked about it before. Natural unemployment. Oops. Oh man, my handwriting's bad. Try this one more time. Natural unemployment. These are these people who are college graduates, for instance, who are between jobs, people moving to a new city and haven't started a new job, somebody who is training for a new degree in order to get a job because a robot replaced their job. So anyway, natural unemployment is the frictional people between jobs, and the structural, like, hey, you lost your job simply because we have a new robot, but you'll find another job sooner or later. The frictional unemployment and the structural unemployment, and that equals about 5%. In the long run, that unemployment rate is going to naturally gravitate toward that natural rate. Right. Historically, it's been somewhere in the neighborhood of 5%, so we're just going to go with that 5% number for now. So there's your long-run Phillips curve. Doesn't really matter what the inflation rate is, we'll stay there. If we are in a recession, as you saw earlier, we're going to be at point A. We'll call that a recession. In a recession, we have higher unemployment rates, and we have pretty low inflation rates. Over here, this would be point B. We'll call that our inflationary gap. At that point, we have higher inflation because we have really, really low unemployment. And then, of course, our equilibrium, our long-run equilibrium, is always going to shift back to this long-run Phillips curve. So at this point, we are in equilibrium. Equilibrium means we are at full employment. We have a low inflation rate, but not as low as we would during a recession, and we have low unemployment. Now that equilibrium is just along this curve. In the long term, this short-run Phillips curve can actually shift up and down, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. So here's the first, 3 of your AP Macroeconomics graphs. I'll come back in part 2 of this video to do the remaining ones, and then we'll look at a couple different scenarios.